Say it again, my mother's voice said through the old tape. This time, don't cry. A little girl dragged in a broken breath, and the recording filled with soft static. I heard my mother whisper something else, too low for me to understand, before the tape clicked off. I listened to that voice 3 days after my wedding, but 4 months ago, I still had no idea it would explain why my parents had abandoned my ceremony to travel with my younger sister. Before I tell you how I found that recording, I hope you're doing well today. Stay with me, because the empty chairs at my wedding were only the beginning, and please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss what happened after my mother came home. My wedding morning began with the sound of my phone vibrating against the wooden dressing table. I had just finished fastening one pearl earring when the screen lit up with a message from my mother. There was no apology, no request to call, and no last-minute explanation. "You're too far away," she wrote. "Your father and I are traveling with Emily. We hope you understand." I read it twice, although the words were simple enough. My parents lived in Raleigh, about 4 hours from the inn outside Asheville, where Nathan and I were getting married. They had received our save-the-date 11 months earlier, confirmed the date, and watched me arrange the entire event without asking them for $1. At that exact moment, they were sitting in an airport with my sister, preparing to fly much farther than 4 hours for a promotional trip to Costa Rica. A photograph appeared in our family group chat less than a minute later. Emily stood between them beneath an international departures sign, one hand looped through my mother's arm. My father was smiling in the restrained way he always did, when he wanted to look supportive without appearing emotional. Their luggage bore matching tags from Emily's travel company. Nathan came into the room while I was taking a screenshot. He had already changed into his suit trousers, though his white shirt was still open at the collar. He looked at my face, then at the phone in my hand, and asked the only question that mattered. "What do you want to do?" Not what did they say, not how could they do this. He did not offer to call my father, or demand an explanation on my behalf. He asked what I wanted, and that was one reason I was marrying him. "I want to get married," I said. My voice did not shake. I saved the screenshot in a folder, muted the family chat, and placed my phone face down beside the makeup brushes. I did not call my mother. I did not give her the satisfaction of hearing whether she had hurt me. Back then, I called that dignity. Looking back, I know part of it was also fear. I had spent years leaving conversations before anyone could reject me again, and I had become so skilled at walking away that people often mistook it for not caring. The inn's ballroom was small, warm, and filled with spring light. Nathan and I had chosen it because the windows overlooked a line of green hills, not because it looked expensive. We had paid for the wedding ourselves, kept the guest list limited, and planned everything around the people who had consistently been part of our lives. The family table stood close to the dance floor. When I entered the room before the ceremony, I saw 2 untouched place settings at its center. Printed cards rested against the water glasses. Mother of the bride, father of the bride. I stopped in front of them. I had known for weeks that my parents might choose Emily's trip. My mother had avoided confirming their travel plans, while my father kept saying they were still working out the timing. Yet I had never asked the venue to remove their names. Some stubborn part of me had imagined the ballroom doors opening at the last minute. I had pictured my mother hurrying inside with an excuse, my father adjusting his tie as though being late were the only offense. I had left those cards there because, beneath everything I claimed to understand, I was still waiting. I picked them up. Margaret and Thomas were standing near the entrance. My aunt had raised me from the age of 13, after my parents sent me to her house for what they called a temporary family arrangement. My uncle had taught me to drive, helped me apply to college, and shown up at every graduation without needing to be reminded. I turned the cards over and asked a server for a pen. On the blank sides, I wrote Margaret Reed and Thomas Reed. Margaret watched me place the cards back against the glasses. Her expression tightened, and she touched my wrist before I could move away. "Aaron, we don't want to take anyone's place." "You aren't taking it," I said. "I'm giving it to the people who came." For a moment, she could not answer. Thomas pulled out her chair without making a speech or trying to turn the moment into something larger than it was. He waited until she sat, then took the seat beside her. That was all. No one applauded. No one confronted my parents through a video call. I did not stand at the microphone and announce what they had done. I walked down the aisle toward Nathan. The ceremony lasted less than 20 minutes. Nathan's hands were warm around mine, and when I stumbled over one word in my vows, he smiled instead of pretending not to notice. Margaret adjusted the edge of my veil before the photographs. Thomas checked twice to make sure I had eaten something before the reception began. For several hours, my parents' absence became exactly what I wanted it to be. Their decision, not the definition of my wedding. During dinner, Margaret fixed the folded collar at the back of my dress with the same careful fingers that had straightened my school uniforms years earlier. Nathan's friends filled the dance floor. Thomas embarrassed himself, trying to follow a group dance, and laughed harder than anyone when he moved in the wrong direction. I was happy. That fact mattered later, because my mother would claim I had built the entire day to punish her. The truth was much simpler. Once I stopped preserving 2 empty chairs for people who had chosen not to come, there was no punishment left to deliver. Near sunset, the photographer gathered us on the terrace for family portraits. Margaret stood beside me, wearing a pale blue dress and a thin chain around her neck. A small brass key hung from it, darkened with age, its bow shaped like 2 birds facing each other. I had seen the key once before, years earlier, but I could not immediately remember where. "What is that?" I asked. Margaret covered it with her fingers. "Thomas found it in an old sewing box while we were clearing the storage room." Thomas glanced toward her, then at me. "We think it opens the cedar chest your parents sent over when they moved." The chest had arrived at Margaret's house 14 years earlier, mixed in with boxes of my school papers and childhood clothes. My mother had said it contained nothing important and that the key had been lost. It had remained locked in storage ever since. Margaret and Thomas had found the key in February. They had told me then, but I asked them not to open the chest until after the wedding. I had already surrendered too many important days to questions about my family, and I refused to let another one begin with my mother's version of the past. Margaret studied my face. "After tonight, do you still want to know what's inside?" I looked through the terrace doors at Nathan speaking with our guests. I looked at the 2 handwritten place cards visible through the glass. Then I looked at the key resting against Margaret's dress. "Yes," I said. "After tonight, I want all of it." The photographer asked us to move closer. Margaret stood on my left, Thomas beside her, and Nathan took my hand on the other side. The camera flashed. That photograph was sent to the family group chat later that evening. My mother did not comment on my dress, the ceremony, or the man I had just married. She did not ask why she and my father had been replaced at the table. Her message appeared beneath the photograph less than a minute after she saw it. "Why are you wearing that key?" The morning after my wedding, Nathan and I sat by a window in the inn's dining room while rain slid down the glass. The room smelled like coffee, warm bread, and the flowers someone had moved in from the terrace. My husband spread jam across a biscuit and talked about which gifts we should pack first. He did not mention the photograph, the key, or the messages waiting on my phone. He was giving me one ordinary breakfast before my family tried to take ownership of another day. When I turned my phone over, I had 11 missed calls from my mother, 1 from my father, and 4 messages from Emily. The first 3 accused me of humiliating Mom by placing Margaret and Thomas at the family table. The 4th said, "You knew that picture would hurt her. You always have to make everything mean something." I read it once and set the phone beside my coffee. Nathan asked whether I wanted him to drive while I handled the calls. I told him I would respond after we checked out. For once, I was not disappearing from a conflict. I was choosing when it could reach me. Before we left, Keepsake Journeys posted a polished video from Costa Rica. Emily stood on a wooden platform with green mountains behind her, while my parents smiled on either side. The caption read, "Family is about showing up for the moments that matter." Emily spoke about building trips that helped families reconnect. Near the end, she said, "My sister chose a different life, but my parents taught me that real family keeps showing up." I watched the sentence twice. My parents had skipped my wedding to help Emily sell a story about parents who never missed important moments. I had been turned into the absent daughter who chose another life. I had never agreed to be part of her campaign. Until that morning, I thought their trip was another example of favoritism. The video showed me my absence was useful. It made Emily look loyal. My parents looked devoted, and me look like the one who left. I downloaded the video, saved screenshots, and forwarded the link to a private email folder. Working in a library had taught me that memory changed whenever emotion touched it. Dates, original files, and exact words did not. I was not planning revenge. I did not know what I was defending myself against yet. I only knew my mother had seen a key in a wedding photograph and reacted as if someone had opened a locked room inside her house. I called her after we reached home. She answered before the first ring ended. Airport noise and the roll of luggage wheels filled the background. "Where is the chest?" she asked. "At Margaret's house." "Why? Did she give it to you?" "She showed me the key." "Aaron, that box contains old papers and recordings from a very unstable time in this family. Margaret never understood the full context. If she gives you anything, your father and I need to explain before you start making accusations." I leaned against the kitchen counter. Nathan stayed near the doorway, close enough to hear my side, without pretending the call belonged to him. "What recordings?" I asked. My mother paused. "I don't know exactly what's in there." "Then how do you know there are recordings?" "Because your aunt kept everything. She always turned private pain into evidence." I almost corrected her. Margaret had not known what was inside the chest. Instead, I asked whether Thomas had transferred any tapes to digital files. My mother's breath caught. Then her voice softened, the way it always did when fear wanted to sound like concern. She said she was protecting Emily from memories that could be misunderstood. She reminded me that my sister was in the middle of the most important opportunity of her career. Opening the chest that week, she said, would look vindictive. "I haven't told you whether I opened it. You wouldn't ask these questions if you hadn't. I'm asking because you left Costa Rica over a key." She denied it immediately. She claimed the trip had always been ending early and that she only wanted to visit Margaret while she was nearby. Raleigh was not nearby, and neither of us pretended otherwise. I said I would contact her after I knew what the chest contained. She tried to interrupt, but I ended the call. This time, my silence had a boundary attached to it. My father called less than 5 minutes later. His voice was calm and tired, as if he had been asked to clean up a disagreement created by unreasonable women. He said my mother was emotional and warned me against making permanent decisions based on old things without context. When I asked what things he meant, he said he had never paid attention to letters or tapes. He had worked long hours. He trusted my mother to handle the children. "You were one of the parents," I said. "I was providing for the family." "And Mom was handling me?" "That's not what I said." It was exactly what he had said, but arguing would give him room to reshape it. I pulled a notebook from a drawer and wrote down the time, his wording, and the order of his denials. When I asked whether he remembered sending the chest to Margaret when they moved, he said it contained old-school things. Then he warned me not to let Margaret drag me into a version of childhood that had already caused enough damage. Before hanging up, he added, "Your mother may have made mistakes, but she was trying to protect Emily." My parents used different tones but landed on the same instruction. Do not open the chest. Do not trust Margaret. Do not risk Emily's future. Neither asked what I remembered. By the time Nathan and I drove to Margaret's house, I had filled 2 pages with exact phrases. It was the first time I had stopped letting their voices blur together in my head. The cedar chest sat on a work table in Thomas's garage. It was smaller than I remembered, with worn brass corners and a shipping label from my parents' old Raleigh address. Dust covered the lid except where Thomas had lifted it from storage. Before anyone touched the lock, I photographed every side, the label, the hinges, and the 2-bird key in Margaret's palm. Thomas explained that the chest had arrived with my old belongings when my parents moved 14 years earlier. It had remained locked ever since. He found the key only 2 months before, inside a sewing box from the same house. I asked them not to move anything once the chest opened. Thomas found a local service that could convert old cassettes without altering the originals, and I requested a rush appointment for the next morning. Margaret looked unsettled by how methodical I sounded, but my parents had begun arguing about context before I had seen a single page. If the contents mattered, I wanted their source to remain clear. Margaret's phone rang while Thomas wrote down the service address. My mother had left the lodge outside Monteverde and was being driven toward San Jose, but she had missed the last useful connection. She would spend the night near the airport, fly through Atlanta the next day, and reach Asheville on Tuesday morning. 3 days after my wedding, Margaret lowered the phone and asked whether we should wait. Nathan looked at me, but he did not answer for me. I picked up the brass key and felt its uneven teeth press into my fingers. My mother had crossed countries to stop us from opening a box she claimed held nothing but misunderstood memories. "No," I said. "We open it before she gets here." The lock resisted once, then turned with a dry click. A faint cedar smell escaped, mixed with paper and trapped dust. On top of a stack of school folders lay a cream-colored envelope addressed to Emily in my 13-year-old handwriting. Across the back, in my mother's sharper script, were 5 words. "Return to sender. She does not want contact." The handwriting on the envelope was mine, but the sentence across the back belonged to my mother. I had written that letter when I was 13. The paper had yellowed at the edges, and my name on the return address leaned sharply to the right, the way it did before a teacher forced me to slow down. I remembered choosing the envelope from a pack Margaret kept in her desk. I remembered believing that if I made it look neat enough, Emily would understand I had not forgotten her. Margaret did not reach for the letter. Instead, she went into the house and returned with a gray file box I had seen on the top shelf of her office for years. Unlike the cedar chest, it had never been locked. She set it on the work table and removed a notarized caregiver authorization signed by both my parents when I was 13. The reason listed was only temporary family arrangement. Behind it were school forms and medical authorizations signed again each year until I turned 18. My parents had renewed the arrangement 5 times. There was no custody order transferring me to Margaret, no report saying I was dangerous, and no court finding that I had harmed Emily. The papers did not prove every story my mother had told was false, but they proved one thing I had never been allowed to say with certainty. My parents had not lost me in a moment of confusion. They had chosen, year after year, to keep me outside their home. I placed the documents in date order and photographed every signature. Thomas watched me work, his arms folded tightly across his chest. Margaret stood beside him with both hands pressed against the edge of the table. "We should have made you read those when you turned 18, she said. "Yes," I answered. She flinched, but I did not soften it for her. I loved Margaret. She had given me a stable home when I needed one. That did not mean every decision she made had been right. Loving someone did not require pretending their silence had cost nothing. We returned to the cedar chest. Thomas held the lid while I photographed the lock, the brass key with the 2 birds, the old shipping label from my parents' Raleigh address, and the dust that had settled around the hinges. Beneath a stack of school folders were envelopes, folded drawings, 2 full-sized cassettes, and several microcassettes in clear plastic cases. None of them belonged to Margaret's house. They had all come from my parents' home when the locked chest was delivered 14 years earlier. I opened the first group of letters slowly. They were arranged by year, although I did not remember arranging them. The earliest ones were cheerful. I asked Emily about school, the songs she liked, and whether she still slept with the rabbit I had won for her at a carnival. I wrote that Margaret had planted tomatoes and that Thomas burned pancakes every Sunday. I promised I would come home when Mom said it was safe. The later letters were shorter. Some had postal marks showing they had been returned. Others had never been mailed. On several envelopes, my mother had written instructions in the same narrow handwriting. "Emily does not want this. Do not confuse her. Retourne to sender." I read only enough to understand the pattern. Every time I reached toward my sister, my mother had stood between us and called it protection. Near the bottom of the stack was a letter I had written at 16. The envelope had been opened, then sealed again with clear tape. I did not read it yet. Something about the pressure of my own handwriting made my stomach tighten, and I set it aside. Under the letters were drawings, made with crayons and dull-colored pencils. The name Emily appeared on the backs in a child's uneven hand. There were no stamps or postal marks. One card showed two girls holding hands beneath a yellow sun. Another showed two birds standing on opposite sides of a fence. Inside, Emily had written, "I still save your place in the birthday song." The spelling was wrong in 3 places. The meaning was not. Margaret sat down hard in a folding chair. "I never saw these." I believed her. The cards had been locked inside a chest sent from my mother's house. Margaret could not have hidden something she did not know existed. That realization did not erase the questions I had for her, but it removed one accusation I had carried for years. Emily had remembered me. The thought did not bring comfort. It brought anger so clean and sharp that my hands became steady. My mother had told me Emily was afraid. She had told Emily I had chosen to leave. Then she had kept proof that both stories were incomplete. By Monday morning, Thomas had taken the audio items to a local conversion service that accepted rush work. The originals remained in numbered sleeves, and the employee documented each label before creating digital copies. I spent the day scanning letters, matching envelopes to dates, and saving copies in 3 separate locations. Nathan helped without touching a page until I asked. He made food, answered the door, and reminded me that organizing the evidence did not require me to understand all of it at once. Carol reached Asheville on Tuesday afternoon. Her suitcase still carried an airline tag when Margaret opened the front door. My mother stepped inside without greeting anyone and looked directly toward the dining room, where the cedar chest sat closed on the table. "That belongs to our family," she said. "So does Aaron," Margaret replied. My mother's face tightened. She turned to me and asked whether I had opened it. I told her every paper had been photographed, the originals were secured, and the recordings were being converted by a professional service. For the first time since the wedding, she stopped trying to sound concerned. "You had no right. The chest was sent with my belongings. Those were private conversations from a terrible period. You were angry. Emily was frightened. Your father and I were trying to hold the family together. You held it together by removing one person from it." Carol looked toward Nathan, then Thomas, then Margaret. She had always been strongest in private, where she could adjust her story to the listener. 4 witnesses left her nowhere to place a different version. She lowered her voice. "This will destroy Emily's career." I had not mentioned Emily's business. Why would old family papers destroy a travel campaign? My mother opened her mouth, then closed it. She asked to speak with me alone. I refused. She said Margaret had manipulated me, that Thomas had no idea what he was involved in, and that Nathan had known me for too little time to understand our family. Each accusation failed, because the person she blamed was standing close enough to hear it. When she finally reached for the chest, I moved between her and the table. "You came 3 days too late," I said. "There is no single copy left for you to take." Her expression changed then. Not grief, not guilt. Calculation. She picked up her suitcase and told me I would regret tearing apart the only family I had. I did not remind her that she had skipped my wedding. I simply opened the door. An hour after she left, the conversion service called. One cassette had transferred cleanly without restoration. The label, written in red marker, read, "For Aaron, from Emily." We played it through a small speaker at Margaret's kitchen table. Static filled the room, followed by the thin, bright voice of a little girl singing "Happy Birthday." I knew the voice before Margaret covered her mouth. Emily missed one note, laughed, and started the line again. For several seconds after the song, there was only the soft mechanical hiss of the tape. Then Emily spoke again, much quieter. "I'm scared of Aaron." I stared at the speaker until the words stopped sounding like language. The cards beside me said she had saved my place. The tape said she had feared me. I turned to Margaret. "What did I do to her?" I asked. Margaret did not answer because she could not. The speaker continued to release a low mechanical hiss, but I had stopped hearing it. In my mind, I was 13 again, walking Emily away from our house while she cried for our mother. I remembered her small hand twisting inside mine, her shoes scraping the sidewalk, and the way she kept looking behind us, as if someone might come running after her. At the time, I believed I was rescuing her from another night of shouting. For the first time, I wondered whether she had experienced it as being taken away by the sister who frightened her. Nathan moved closer but did not touch the laptop. Is that the end of the recording? The song ended. That isn't what I asked. I looked at the audio bar. Nearly a minute remained after Emily's sentence. The blank section was long enough that anyone listening casually might have stopped the file. I pressed play again and forced myself to stay still. Static filled Margaret's kitchen, followed by the soft bump of something touching the microphone. Then my mother's voice emerged from farther away. "Say it again," Carol said. "This time, don't cry." Emily sniffed. "I don't want to." "You want Erin to get better, don't you?" "Yes." "Then say what I told you. Tell her you're afraid." There was another pause, followed by the faint sound of a chair moving. Emily's voice became smaller. "If I say it, can Erin come home later?" My mother answered without hesitation. "Just do what Mommy asked." The recording ended with the cassette button clicking under someone's finger. No confession followed. Carol never said she was lying. She had not needed to invent my sister's voice because she had taught a frightened 6-year-old which words to use. The first sentence on the tape had been technically real. Everything around it had been designed to change what it meant. Margaret covered her face. Thomas stared at the table as if the wood might split beneath his hands. I felt no relief. Knowing Emily had been coached did not erase the image of her crying as I took her from the house. It only proved that my mother had found the most painful memory both of us possessed and sharpened it until it could cut in 2 directions. I copied the full audio file into a new folder and named it with the date written on the cassette label. Then I photographed the cassette again beside the conversion receipt and the numbered sleeve from the service. My hands moved with the calm precision I used when handling fragile archival material at work. I needed the routine because the alternative was to call Emily and demand she admit that our mother had manipulated her. Instead, I sent her the complete file privately. I wrote only one sentence. "Listen past the first silence." Her reply arrived 12 minutes later. "You expect me to believe this hasn't been edited?" I had expected anger, denial, or no response at all. The accusation still landed harder than it should have. My first impulse was to tell her she sounded exactly like our parents. I typed the sentence, stared at it, then deleted it. Winning that exchange would not prove anything. I sent her the photographs of the original cassette, the label in our mother's handwriting, the conversion receipt, and the service information. "Choose another company," I wrote. "You can inspect the original with a neutral technician. I won't send it through Mom or Dad." Emily called before I could put the phone down. Her face appeared on the screen from a hotel room near the airport. She had removed the polished makeup from the travel video, and her hair was tied back carelessly. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. "You made copies," she said. "Yes." "Who has them?" "Me. Nathan. Margaret and Thomas have access to one backup. No one else has heard your voice." Her eyes narrowed. "Not the sponsor?" "No." "Not the family?" "No." She looked away from the camera. "Mom says you're preparing to send everything out. Mom also said you did not want my letters." Emily's jaw tightened. "You think one tape erases everything you did?" There it was, the old shape of our arguments. I had evidence against our mother, and Emily answered with evidence against me. In the past, I would have ended the call before she could use it. This time, I remained silent long enough for her to continue. She reached for something outside the camera frame. A photograph appeared in our text thread while we were still connected. It showed a sheet of lined paper covered in my teenage handwriting. I recognized the loops in the lowercase letters, and the heavy pressure where my pen had nearly torn the page. One sentence had been framed tightly in the image. "Maybe you'll be happier without me." My stomach tightened. "Where did you get that?" "I found the letter when I was 17. That's my handwriting." "I know. You've had this all these years?" "I had the picture." Mom took the letter back. The instinct to defend myself came fast. I wanted to say the page had been cropped. I wanted to accuse Carol of changing the words or arranging them in a false order, but there was no need to examine the ink. I remembered writing the sentence. I had been living with Margaret for almost a year. My early letters to Emily had come back unopened, and every phone call ended with my mother telling me Emily became upset when she heard my name. I had written that letter late at night at Margaret's dining table, after everyone else had gone to bed. I had tried to sound older than I was. I had told Emily I loved her, that I understood if she no longer wanted me, and that maybe she would be happier without me. At 13, I believed letting someone go was the purest kind of love. I did not understand that telling a 6-year-old she might be happier without her sister was still a form of abandonment, even when written from a place of pain. My mother had removed the rest of the letter, but she had not invented that sentence. I had given it to her. I wrote it, I said. Emily blinked, as if she had expected a denial. So you admit it? I admit I wrote a cruel sentence after almost a year of being told you were afraid of me and wanted no contact. I don't admit that it meant I stopped loving you. You said I would be happier without you. I was 13, and I was 6. The words struck with more force because they were true. Emily had been a child when my mother coached her voice, but I had also been a child when I wrote the letter. Neither sentence should have been used as a final judgment against us. Yet Emily and I had each spent years treating the other's childhood pain as proof of adult intention. Nathan remained on the other side of the kitchen, far enough away that Emily could not see him. He did not signal what I should say. I was grateful for that. I needed to answer as myself, not as the version of me who wanted an ally to certify that I had never done anything wrong. I am sorry I wrote that, I said. It was not fair to put the burden of my leaving on you. But I did not choose to leave, and I did not know Mom kept that sentence while returning everything else. Emily's expression shifted, but not into forgiveness. You don't get to decide which words count because you were hurt. No, and neither does Mom. She went quiet. I watched her eyes move towards something on the hotel desk, perhaps another message from Carol. For years, I had imagined that if Emily ever saw proof, she would immediately understand me. I had never considered that the truth might force her to hold two painful facts at once. Our mother had manipulated us, and I had still written something that wounded her. When can you come to Asheville? I asked. Why? Because we cannot keep doing this through cropped pages and forwarded recordings. We need to put every version on the same table. I'm not sitting in Margaret's house while everyone watches me. Then choose somewhere else. No Mom, no Dad, no Margaret or Thomas. I glanced toward Nathan. He gave no visible reaction, but I knew he disliked the idea of sending me alone into a conversation that had ended badly before. No Nathan either, Emily added. Just you and me. I wanted to refuse. I wanted witnesses, a recorder, and a room full of people who already believed me. Those things would make me safer, but they might also make Emily feel that the verdict had been reached before she arrived. Somewhere public, I said, and we both bring copies, not originals. Emily agreed to meet later that week in Asheville. Her voice had become flat and controlled, the same tone I used when emotion threatened to expose too much. Before ending the call, she looked directly into the camera. There's something else you need to know. What? The picture I sent you wasn't the first time I saw one of your letters. I waited. Emily swallowed. I found a full letter when I was 17. I read enough to know you had been trying to reach me. The room seemed to contract around the phone in my hand. Then why did you give it back to Mom? Emily did not answer. She ended the call, leaving her last admission hanging between us. For the first time, I knew my sister had been given a chance to question our mother's story long before my wedding. She had seen evidence that I had not simply disappeared, and she had chosen not to follow it. What I did not yet know was what our mother had said to make her look away. After Emily ended the call, I sat at Margaret's kitchen table with my phone still pressed against my palm. She had seen one of my letters when she was 17. She had known I had tried to reach her, yet 14 years passed before she told me. Anger came easily, but beneath it was a more difficult question. If Emily had found one hidden letter, What else had the adults around us known and chosen not to say? I returned to the gray file box, while Nathan drove home to collect clothes and give me space. The yearly caregiver authorizations were organized in separate folders, each one containing school forms, medical permissions, and copies of insurance cards. Near the back of the first folder, a single page had been clipped behind the authorization. It was not a court order or an official custody document. It was a private agreement typed on my mother's stationery. Margaret Reed agreed that I would not speak directly with Emily by telephone, mail, or in person without Carol's approval. Any attempt by me to contact my sister would be reported immediately. At the bottom of the page were my mother's signature, my father's initials, and Margaret's full name written in blue ink. I read it 3 times before looking up. Margaret stood near the sink, washing a cup that had already been clean. Thomas was outside making a phone call, and the house was quiet enough that I could hear the water striking the porcelain. "Did you sign this?" I asked. Margaret turned off the faucet. Her eyes dropped to the page, and whatever explanation she had been preparing disappeared from her face. Yes. The answer hurt more because she did not deny it. For most of my adult life, I had divided my family into 2 simple groups: the people who abandoned me and the people who saved me. That page refused to stay inside either category. I set it on the table between us. "You knew Mom was stopping me from talking to Emily. I knew she didn't want direct contact for a while. The agreement says you had to report me if I tried." Margaret pulled out a chair, but did not sit. "Erin, you need to understand what was happening then." "No, you need to answer before you explain." My voice remained calm, but I kept one hand on the page so she could not fold it away. "Who wrote it? Why did you sign it? How long did you follow it? And why did you never tell me?" Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. "Your mother wrote it. She brought it with the first caregiver authorization. She said if I refused, she would take you home that afternoon. That was where I wanted to go. She wasn't going to keep you there." I felt my shoulders tighten. "What does that mean?" Margaret finally sat across from me. She said Carol had arrived at her house 3 days after leaving me there, furious that Margaret had questioned the arrangement. My mother claimed I was turning Emily against David and creating instability in the home. If Margaret interfered again, Carol said she would take me back long enough to enroll me in a residential therapeutic program in another state. The phrase sounded clinical and responsible. Margaret described it differently. It was a locked program for troubled teenagers, several hours away, with restricted calls and visits. Carol had already requested brochures. "I didn't know whether she could actually place you there," Margaret said, "but she was your legal parent. I was afraid that if I challenged her before we had anything formal in place, she would remove you from my house and make sure I could not see you again. So you gave her what she wanted. I signed because I thought keeping you with us was safer than letting her send you away. You decided that without telling me. You were 13. I was the person being traded." Margaret's face crumpled, but I refused to rescue her from the sentence. She said she and Thomas believed the restriction would last a few weeks, perhaps until David calmed down. They told themselves that once my parents saw I was doing well, they would allow supervised calls. Instead, every request was delayed. Carol said Emily was having nightmares, then stomachaches, then trouble at school whenever my name came up. Thomas entered while Margaret was speaking. He stopped when he saw the agreement and sat beside her without asking what had happened. His presence changed nothing. I asked whether he had known she signed it. "Yes," he said. "I argued with her about it. Then I agreed." "Why?" "Because your mother had the power to take you out of our house. We were afraid of losing the chance to protect you at all." I looked from one to the other. Their fear was understandable. Their decision had still taken something from me. "How long did you follow it?" Margaret admitted that during the first year, she told Carol whenever I asked to call Emily. She mailed some of my letters after receiving permission, but most were returned or intercepted. Later, when she realized Carol would never approve direct contact, she allowed me to send letters without asking first. She had believed the returned envelopes meant Emily or my parents were rejecting them. She never knew Carol was storing some of my letters and Emily's cards inside the locked chest. "Why didn't you tell me when I turned 18?" I asked. Margaret's answer came more slowly. She said I had left for college determined never to need my parents again. Whenever she mentioned Carol or David, I shut down the conversation. After the disastrous meeting with Emily when I was 25, I told Margaret I did not want anyone bringing my family into my life unless I asked. "I thought respecting that was the kindest thing I could do," she said. "You thought deciding for me was kind. I thought you had survived enough. That was not your decision to make." The words sat between us. Margaret nodded, though tears had gathered in her eyes. She did not tell me she had done her best. She did not say I should be grateful for the home she gave me. Instead, she admitted that fear had shaped her choices long after the original threat had passed. "I protected the girl you were," she said, "and then I kept treating the woman you became as if she could not survive the truth. I was wrong. I believed her. Believing her did not make the betrayal disappear." I stood and carried the agreement to the scanner. I saved it with the caregiver papers, then added a note, explaining that it was a private document, not a court order. The distinction mattered. My mother had not needed a judge to separate us. She only needed frightened adults to accept her rules. Margaret went upstairs while I finished scanning. When she returned, she held a child's birthday card inside a clear plastic sleeve. 2 birds had been drawn in blue crayon, each standing on one side of a brown fence. One bird was larger, with long black lines for hair. The smaller bird had yellow wings and a crooked red bow. Inside, Emily had written, "I will wait for you to sing the birthday song again." I traced the air above the letters without touching the paper. The card had been locked inside the chest with no stamp, address, or postal mark. Emily had made it but never mailed it. At 6 years old, she had believed I might come back before the next birthday. Margaret said nothing while I read it. She did not need to explain what the card proved. Emily had not wanted me gone. Our mother had taught each of us to interpret the other's silence as a choice. I photographed both sides, then placed the card beside the cassette sleeve. One object carried Emily's natural voice. The other carried the words Carol had instructed her to say. The difference between them was the entire architecture of our childhood. That afternoon, I reserved a small meeting room at a co-working space near downtown Asheville. It was neutral, public, and available without using my position at the library. I booked 2 hours, requested a room with glass walls facing the main corridor, and prepared a folder containing copies of the caregiver authorizations, the private agreement, several returned envelopes, the conversion receipt, and the transcript of the cassette. The originals remained secured at Margaret's house. Nathan offered to wait in the building. I told him Emily had asked to meet alone. He did not argue, but he made me promise to call when the meeting ended. Before I left, Margaret stood beside the front door, with the 2-bird card still in its sleeve. "I know what you want from her," she said. "You want her to see the evidence and understand everything. I want her to stop pretending she never had a reason to question Mom. She may bring something you don't want to see. I already saw the sentence. One sentence is easier to hate than a whole person." I almost told Margaret she had lost the right to advise me about truth. The thought was cruel, and part of me wanted to say it anyway. Instead, I told her I needed time, before I could decide what our relationship looked like after that day. Margaret nodded. "You can love me, and still be angry with me. That is what I'm trying to learn." Emily arrived 9 minutes late. Through the glass wall, I watched her walk down the corridor, carrying a leather work bag against her side. She wore dark trousers and a white blouse creased from travel. There was no mother beside her, no father calling ahead, and no polished smile from the Costa Rica campaign. She entered without hugging me and took the chair across the table. I placed my folder between us, but she did not look at it. Instead, she opened her bag and removed a printed photograph of the letter I had written as a teenager. She placed the page in front of me and tapped the sentence that had haunted both of us. "I read this when I was 17, Emily said, "and I gave it back to Mom." I looked at the printed photograph beneath her hand. The image showed only part of the letter, but I could see enough to recognize the blue ink, the lined paper, and the sentence our mother had preserved as if it were the only thing I had ever written. Emily's fingers rested near the edge of the page without touching my handwriting. There was no apology in her expression, only the guarded look of someone who expected to be accused and had arrived prepared to defend herself. I closed the folder I had brought and told her we needed one rule before either of us continued. We would speak only about what we had personally seen, heard, written, or done. Neither of us would repeat something Mom or Dad had said as though it were established fact. Emily leaned back in her chair. That rule would have been useful about 20 years ago. Yes, I said. It would have. She looked toward the glass wall of the meeting room, where people passed through the co-working space carrying coffee and laptops. For a moment, I thought she might leave. Instead, she took a breath and told me that when she was 17, she had gone into our mother's bedroom looking for a passport application. In the bottom drawer of Carol's desk, beneath tax folders and old warranties, she found 3 envelopes with my handwriting on them. 2 had been opened. The third was still sealed. She read the one on top, because my name was not on the outside, only hers. It mentioned the birthday song, Emily said. The one on the cassette. I remembered that letter. I had written that I still sang the wrong harmony, because she used to laugh when I missed the high note. I had asked whether she remembered the 2 birds she drew on every birthday card. I had told her I was sorry for leaving the house without saying goodbye properly, though I had not understood then that my parents had arranged for me never to return. What did you do after you read it? I asked. I took pictures of a few pages with my phone. Then I carried the letters downstairs and asked Mom why she had them. Emily's voice became quieter as she described what happened next. Carol did not deny hiding the letters. She sat at the kitchen table and began to cry. She told Emily I only wrote when I wanted to disrupt the family, that I resented David for keeping the marriage together, and that every time I reappeared, our parents fought for weeks. Then she asked Emily whether she wanted to be responsible for another separation. She said Dad had almost left because of you before, Emily said. She said if I encouraged contact, I might finally push him out. And you believed her. I was 17. You were 17 when you became afraid, I said. You are 31 now. Her face hardened. So, that erases what she did? No, it explains why you handed the letters back. It does not explain the next 14 years. Emily's chair shifted against the floor. She said I had no idea what it was like to grow up in that house after I left. David became silent whenever my name came up. Carol would cry for hours and then pretend nothing had happened. Emily learned that asking about me could ruin an entire weekend. She kept the photographs in an old folder when she changed phones, but she stopped opening them because every time she did, she felt disloyal to someone. You were manipulated, I said. I believe that. But you also repeated their version after you were old enough to question it. You told people I abandoned you. You used that story in your company's campaign. You skipped my wedding after knowing the date for almost a year. I had a contract. You had other dates. Her eyes flickered, confirming that she knew I had seen the scheduling emails. She said the alternative weekends would have cost her the sponsor, and that Mom had insisted I would understand. I reminded her that she never asked whether I understood. She had sent one message saying my wedding could not stop everyone else's lives, then boarded the plane. Emily pressed her lips together. You want me to say I chose them. I want you to say you made a choice. She stared at me for several seconds, and I could see the moment she stopped trying to become completely innocent. I made one, she said. I chose the trip. I told myself it was business, but part of me wanted you to know what it felt like when someone chose another life instead of you. The admission hurt, but it was cleaner than another excuse. I asked whether she had ever considered that I had not chosen another life. She said the thought had occurred to her after she found the letters, but questioning our parents meant questioning everything that had made her feel secure. She had been the daughter who stayed, the daughter who supported them, the daughter they showed up for. If I had not left willingly, then some of what Emily received had been built on my removal. You benefited from the story, I said. Yes. She did not add that she had been young, frightened, or confused. For the first time, she allowed the word to stand alone. I opened my folder and slid copies of the returned envelopes, the caregiver authorizations, and the private contact agreement across the table. Emily read each page without speaking. When she reached Margaret's signature, she looked up sharply. I explained that Margaret and Thomas had agreed to restrict contact because Carol threatened to remove me from their house and send me to a residential program. I also told her Margaret had kept the agreement hidden from me after I became an adult. So everyone decided for us, Emily said. Yes. And then we helped them by refusing to ask each other enough questions. Her eyebrows lifted. You're including yourself now? I thought of the coffee shop when I was 25. Emily had brought the photograph of my letter and pushed it across the table exactly as she had done that day. I had seen the sentence about her being happier without me, heard her say I had abandoned the family, and walked out before she could explain where the page came from. For years, I described that exit as the moment I finally protected myself. Sitting across from her again, I could admit that I had also been afraid. I left because I thought the next answer would prove you hated me, I said. I did not ask why Mom had the letter. I did not ask whether you had seen the rest. I decided leaving first was better than hearing you reject me. You always do that. The sentence irritated me because it was true. I told her walking away had protected me when I was young, but I had turned it into a habit. Emily said my silence had often felt like punishment, as though I expected her to discover the correct apology without being told what I needed. I wanted to argue that she had never earned instructions for repairing the relationship. Instead, I wrote the point in the margin of my timeline. We did not forgive each other in that room. We created rules. Any message, email, or call from Carol or David that mentioned the other sister would be forwarded exactly as received within 24 hours. No summaries. No private assurances that one parent meant well. Neither of us would demand an immediate emotional response after sending evidence. If one of us needed space, we would say how long instead of disappearing. The arrangement was not trust. It was a test designed to prevent our parents from building two different realities between us. Emily photographed the rules. What happens if one of us breaks them? The other one stops sharing information. That sounds like you. It probably is. A faint smile touched her face, but it vanished before either of us could mistake it for reconciliation. We packed our copies separately. Emily took nothing from my folder, and I did not ask for the photographs on her phone. When we left the room, she walked toward the elevator while I remained near the windows to call Nathan. My father called first. I answered on speaker and told him Emily had just left. He immediately said she was using the family crisis to protect her company. According to him, Emily had always been ambitious, and now that the sponsor might question her campaign, she would say anything that made her look deceived. He warned me not to let her turn me against the only people who had consistently cared. While he spoke, my phone vibrated with a screenshot from Emily. David had texted her at the same time. Aaron has been waiting for a chance to destroy this family. Don't let her use your company as the weapon. I stared at the two versions on my screen. In one, Emily was manipulating me. In the other, I was manipulating Emily. My father had not even waited for us to reach our cars before trying to rebuild the wall between us. I have to go, I told him. Aaron, listen to me before your sister. I ended the call and forwarded Emily a screenshot of my call log with a summary of his exact words. She replied with the full message thread, including the timestamp. For the first time, my father's strategy failed before it had time to settle inside either of us. That evening, an email arrived from him with the subject line, "My honest account." He wrote that he had never known Carol kept my letters, never instructed anyone to use Emily's fear against me, and had always believed I preferred living with Margaret. He offered to answer any question in writing because, as he put it, facts mattered more than emotion. I saved the email without replying. Then I opened the newest file from the cassette conversion service. It came from a microcassette removed from my parents' old answering machine and packed into the cedar chest during their move. The recording began with a mechanical beep, followed by the voice of the man who had just claimed he knew nothing. "Carol," my father said, "Erin stays where she is. If you have to, tell her Emily is afraid of her." I played the voicemail 3 times before I opened my father's email again. In writing, David sounded measured, almost generous. He said he had worked long hours, trusted Carol to manage communication with us, and believed I had been happier living with Margaret and Thomas. He wrote that he had never told anyone to use Emily's fear against me, and would never have manipulated one daughter to control the other. The message had arrived under the subject line, "My honest account," but it was not an account. It was a clean room with every object that could incriminate him removed. My father admitted to being busy, distant, and perhaps too trusting, because those were respectable failures. He blamed no one directly, yet every sentence pointed toward my mother. I had sent him 5 questions. Who decided I would remain with Margaret? Who said Emily was afraid of me? Did he threaten to leave if I came home? Did he know my letters were being blocked? When had he first learned Carol was telling us different stories? His answers were long, but only one was definite. He had never suggested using Emily. Then I pressed play. The recording began with the mechanical beep of an answering machine. David's voice followed, younger but unmistakable, speaking with the impatient confidence of a man leaving instructions he expected to be followed. "Carol, Erin stays where she is. If you have to, tell her Emily is afraid of her. Erin listens when it concerns her sister. Margaret can keep handling school and appointments until we decide this arrangement is over. I'm not coming home to another argument about it." There was a pause, the sound of papers moving, and then one final sentence. "If Erin thinks she's protecting Emily, she won't fight us." The message ended. My father had not merely agreed with my mother's decision. He had understood exactly what would make me cooperate. At 13, I would have fought punishment, accusations, and threats. I would not have fought a 6-year-old sister who said she feared me. David had turned the part of me that loved Emily most into the lock on my own cage. Nathan stood beside the dining table while I photographed the microcassette, its numbered sleeve, and the conversion receipt. He asked why I had not already sent the file to Emily, Margaret, and every relative my parents had contacted. 4 months earlier, I might have called my hesitation weakness. By then, I understood I was choosing the order in which the truth moved. "My father wrote that email without knowing I had this," I said. "I want his denial preserved exactly as he gave it." Nathan nodded. "You want the lie beside the evidence. I want no one to claim he was confused after hearing the tape." I saved the original audio file in 3 locations and exported a listening copy. I placed David's email, the voicemail transcript, the photographs, and the conversion documentation in the same folder. I did not send it to the family group chat. I had spent most of my life reacting to whichever version reached me first. This time, I would not let anger decide the sequence. My mother texted before noon. Her message did not mention the cassette because she did not yet know which recordings had been recovered. Instead, she wrote that David had forced her to choose between keeping the marriage intact and bringing me home. She said she had been terrified he would leave, take Emily, and abandon her the way her own father had abandoned her family. She ended by saying she hoped I could understand that she had been a frightened woman trying to protect 2 daughters with no good options. I read the message carefully. She admitted fear. She admitted David's ultimatum. She did not admit returning my letters, keeping Emily's cards, coaching the birthday recording, or continuing the lie for years after I became an adult. Even in confession, Carol selected the smallest period of responsibility and tried to place everything outside it. I replied with one question. "When did you stop being forced?" The typing indicator appeared, vanished, and returned. 10 minutes passed without an answer. An hour later, she sent a photograph of herself and Emily when Emily was 8, as though a family picture could answer for 15 years of intercepted mail. I saved it with the rest, and did not respond. Emily came to my house that afternoon. She sat at the end of the dining table, still wearing the silver bracelet my father had given her during the Costa Rica trip. I explained where the microcassette had been found, showed her the conversion receipt, and let her press play herself. She listened once without moving, then asked to hear it again. On the second playback, she closed her eyes when David said her fear would keep me from fighting. She did not cry or ask me to comfort her. When the recording stopped, she unclasped the bracelet from her wrist. and placed it beside the laptop. "He always said Mom was the emotional one," she said. "He said he stayed out of it because he didn't want to make things worse. He stayed far enough away to deny it." Emily looked at the dark screen. Mom carried the lie. He gave it directions. I told her about David's email and sent her a copy. She read his denial while sitting across from the evidence that disproved it. A few minutes later, she forwarded the voicemail to both our parents with one question. "Which part of this are you going to say you don't remember?" My father called immediately. Emily put him on speaker without warning him. I was in the room. David said the message lacked context, that he had been responding to Carol's panic, and that he could not remember every word spoken during a family crisis 25 years earlier. Emily asked whether the voice was his. He said that was not the point. "It is the first point," she replied. David shifted toward his familiar defense. Carol had told him I was unstable. Carol had controlled the letters. Carol had exaggerated Emily's fear. He said he had trusted his wife and regretted not asking more questions. My mother called Emily while David was still speaking. We ended his call and answered hers. Carol had already learned he was blaming her. She sent a screenshot from an old phone backup showing a message David had written years after I left. "If Aaron comes back into Emily's life, I'm done. I won't live through that chaos again." Within an hour, my parents were sending evidence against each other. Carol forwarded messages about David's threats to leave. David emailed notes, claiming Carol had refused to let him contact me. Each wanted us to declare the other the true architect of what happened. I replied to both of them with the same words. "I will preserve anything relevant you send. I will not help either of you use the truth about the other to escape responsibility for yourself." Neither answered me directly. David sent another explanation to Emily. Carol called Margaret and said she had finally decided to tell the full story. The alliance that had survived by keeping two daughters apart was beginning to break now that those daughters were comparing every message. That evening, Emily left the bracelet on my table. I told her she had forgotten it, but she said she knew where it was. I placed it in an envelope instead of throwing it away. It was still her property, and I was finished making decisions for her just because I believed I understood what an object meant. After she left, I opened my work email to clear a few messages before dinner. Near the top was one from the brand compliance department at North Star Family Escapes. The sender explained that Emily had been unable to provide a signed release authorizing the use of my childhood image and personal family history in their campaign. She had given them my publicly listed professional address so they could contact me directly. The email ended with two questions. Had I ever consented to the use of my photographs? And had I ever represented that I had voluntarily abandoned my family? I read North Star's questions twice before answering. The email did not accuse Emily of lying or ask me to expose my family. It explained that a scheduled campaign post contained a childhood photograph in which I was clearly identifiable, along with a personal story about a sister who voluntarily left the family. Someone had commented beneath an earlier post that Carol and David had skipped my wedding to join Emily's trip, and the contradiction had triggered a routine brand review. Under Emily's contract, every identifiable person needed to consent to the use of their image, and personal stories presented as factual had to be supportable. A second email arrived from Emily. Less than 10 minutes later, she attached a release authorizing Keepsake Journeys and North Star to use my childhood photographs, family background, and likeness in current and future promotional materials. The form was dated that day, although the campaign had already begun. Emily asked me to sign it quickly because compliance had paused the remaining posts. She added that giving North Star my professional email was the only way to stop them from contacting people at random. "You could stop them by telling them the truth," I replied. She called immediately. Emily said the campaign never used my full name and that the childhood photograph belonged to our mother. I reminded her that ownership of a physical photograph did not give her permission to use my face or invent my history. She insisted the story was not invented because everyone in the family had believed I chose to leave. I asked whether she still believed that after reading the letters, hearing the tapes, and seeing the yearly caregiver documents, Her silence lasted long enough to answer me. North Star asked me to confirm only 3 things: whether I had voluntarily separated from my family, whether I had agreed to the use of my image and story, and whether my parents knew my wedding date before choosing the Costa Rica trip. I told them I would respond after reviewing the relevant records. They acknowledged the request and said the internal process could take several weeks. No one threatened Emily, promised a cancellation, or asked for private details beyond those connected to the campaign. Emily came to my house that evening with her laptop. Under our new rule, she showed me the scheduling thread instead of summarizing it. North Star had offered 3 possible weekends for the Costa Rica launch. The first conflicted with another client trip. The second would have required Emily to postpone a smaller booking. The third was my wedding weekend. My mother had replied first. "This is your moment. Erin has already had enough attention over the wedding." My father followed with, "She'll get married whether we're there or not." Emily's reply appeared beneath both messages. "Let's confirm the third weekend." No airline had trapped them. No non-refundable reservation existed before the choice. Emily had selected the date knowing exactly what it meant, and my parents had encouraged her because they assumed I would absorb the insult quietly. "I can explain the business reasons," Emily said. "You already did. You wanted the sponsor." "I have 6 full-time employees, Erin. North Star was funding 6 months of expansion. If they release the next payment, I can keep everyone through the end of the year." "And what are you asking me to do?" "Wait, don't sign the release if you don't want to, but wait before sending them anything. Let the next installment clear, then I'll correct the campaign quietly." I looked at her across my dining table. She was no longer 6 years old repeating our mother's words, or 17 years old being frightened with threats of divorce. She was a 31-year-old business owner asking me to let a false story remain profitable until it had paid enough. "You want them to release money based on information you now know is inaccurate. I want time to protect people who had nothing to do with our family. Your employees are not responsible, but neither am I." My mother called while Emily was still there. Carol said North Star had contacted her and that I needed to stop treating a family misunderstanding like corporate fraud. When I refused to sign, she returned to the argument she had used since I was 13. "You already lost this family," she said. "Do you really need to make Emily lose her future too?" The sentence stripped away 25 years. Once again, my safety, my voice, and my choices were being presented as dangerous luxuries Emily could not afford. At 13, I had stayed away because I believed my presence would hurt her. At 38, I was being asked to let her sell that same lie because correcting it might hurt her company. "I am not taking her future," I said. "I am refusing to let her build it from my past." Carol began to cry. I ended the call before her tears could become another instruction. Anger made my next decisions faster than wisdom did. I opened a new email to North Star and attached everything: the caregiver authorizations, the returned letters, my father's voicemail, the scheduling thread, Emily's childhood cassette, and the photograph of the letter where I had written that she might be happier without me. I wanted the reviewer to see every ugly detail and understand that none of us had invented our pain. Nathan entered while I was reviewing the attachments. He read the file names without touching the keyboard. "What does the recording of a 6-year-old prove about Emily's decisions as an adult?" he asked. "That mom coached her." "Then send evidence of your mother's actions. Why send Emily crying?" I looked at the photograph of my teenage letter. It shows how they used my words too. It also makes a 13-year-old girl confess to something she already regrets. He was not asking me to protect Emily from consequences. He was asking whether I wanted to expose 2 wounded children because I was angry at the adults they became. I removed the cassette and the letter photograph. My parents had used our childhood voices as weapons once. I would not hand those weapons to a corporation. The package I finally sent was narrower and stronger. It contained the caregiver authorization and annual renewals, selected letters with postal markings, and my mother's handwritten instructions, David's voicemail with the conversion documentation, the save the date, the 3 scheduling options, and the emails showing that all 3 of them knowingly selected my wedding weekend. I stated that I had never consented to the use of my image or story, and had never voluntarily abandoned my family. I did not ask North Star to cancel anything. I asked them to correct their records and stop using me. Compliance confirmed receipt and repeated that the review would take several weeks. Emily left without asking me to defend her, but she did not thank me for withholding the childhood recording either. We were not close enough for gratitude to come easily. By the next afternoon, 4 relatives had called. Carol had told one that I had edited the recordings, another that Margaret was trying to steal Emily's company, a third that I had demanded money from North Star, and a fourth that I was punishing my parents for missing one dinner. I opened a new folder beside the sponsor file. For the first time, I did not organize the evidence by person, emotion, or accusation. I named it for the only thing my family had never been required to share: one version. I did not send the one version folder to every relative whose address I could find. I sent it only to the people Carol or David had already contacted, because those were the people being asked to repeat claims about me. The message above the link was brief. I am not asking anyone to choose a side. I am asking you to stop repeating a story you now know is incomplete. Everything included here concerns decisions made by adults, and every document can be traced to its original source. The folder contained the yearly caregiver authorizations, selected returned envelopes, bearing my mother's handwriting, my father's voicemail, his later written denial, the save the date, and the email chain showing how they chose the Costa Rica weekend. It did not include Emily's childhood recording or the letter I had written at 13. Those belonged to 2 frightened girls who had already been used enough. I wanted the adults in my family judged by their adult actions, not protected or condemned by words children had spoken under pressure. The responses did not arrive as one dramatic wave. My cousin Rachel apologized for repeating Carol's claim that I had demanded money from North Star. An uncle wrote that parents sometimes made impossible choices and asked me to consider forgiveness, although he admitted he had never seen the documents before. My mother's older sister said nothing for 4 days, then asked Emily directly whether she had known my wedding date before choosing the trip. Emily answered yes without adding an excuse. That small change mattered more than any public denunciation. Relatives began asking us questions instead of calling my mother for explanations. When Carol said Margaret had manipulated me, someone contacted Margaret. When David said he had never known about the letters, someone forwarded him his own recorded words. My parents were still speaking, but they were no longer the only people allowed to define what had happened. By the end of May, Carol and David had been living apart for several days. My mother stayed with a friend outside Raleigh, while my father remained in their house and told relatives she had become unstable under pressure. Carol responded by forwarding old messages in which he threatened to leave if I returned to the family. Their marriage had survived for 25 years because they had agreed on who would carry the blame. Once each realized the other might sacrifice them, that agreement disappeared. They arrived at Margaret's house on the same afternoon without telling each other they were coming. David walked in first with a legal pad under his arm, as though he had prepared for a business meeting. Carol arrived 7 minutes later, stopped when she saw his car, and accused him of arranging an ambush. Margaret offered neither of them coffee. Thomas closed the front door, and Nathan sat beside me at the dining table without speaking. I had placed the evidence in chronological order. The first caregiver authorization came before the contact restriction. The returned letters came next, followed by the voicemail, the later messages, the wedding scheduling thread, and their written denials. I did not ask why they had done anything until they confirmed what they had done. Carol admitted the handwriting on the envelopes was hers. She said she had returned the letters because Emily became anxious whenever I was mentioned. David admitted the voice on the voicemail was his, but insisted he had been responding to information Carol gave him. When I placed his email denial beside the transcript, he said he had forgotten the exact wording after 25 years. I reminded him that he had not written, "I don't remember." He had written that he never suggested using Emily's fear. My mother seized the opening and said David had threatened to leave unless I stayed with Margaret. My father answered that Carol had controlled the mail and continued the separation long after he stopped paying attention. They spoke across me, each turning my childhood into evidence against the other. I let them continue until they had repeated every defense already preserved in the folder. Then I closed the top page. David designed the method, I said. Carol carried it out and maintained it. Neither of you stopped when I turned 18. Neither of you stopped when Emily became an adult. You do not get to use the other person's guilt as proof of your own innocence. Carol's face changed when she realized I would not select one villain and release the other. She turned toward Emily, who had entered quietly during the argument, and remained near the doorway. My mother said the North Star review could cost Emily $70,000, damage 6 employees, and destroy a company she had spent years building. She told me there was still time to clarify that the campaign had been based on a family misunderstanding. Emily moved to the table and stood beside me. "Do not use my employees to make Aaron lie," she said. Carol stared at her. "I'm trying to save your future." "No, you're using my future the way you used my fear." My mother began to cry, but Emily did not look away. She said she had chosen the wedding weekend, signed the accuracy statement, and repeated a story she had never properly investigated. North Star's decision would affect her business because of her adult choices, not because Aaron had opened a box. She did not ask me to forgive her or defend her. She only told Carol to stop speaking in her name. David leaned back as if Emily's admission proved he had been less responsible. I gave him one final opportunity. "Apologize to me without mentioning Mom," I said. "Tell me what you did, not what she made you do." He looked at the voicemail transcript, then at me. "I'm sorry, but your mother had convinced me that." I closed the folder. "You're not ready," I said. He accused me of setting an impossible standard. I told him the standard was one sentence of responsibility without using his wife as a shield. He could not produce it. David had spent years calling himself the calm parent because Carol performed most of the visible damage. Even with his own voice on the table, he still believed distance from the act meant distance from the blame. The meeting ended without reconciliation. Carol left first, carrying nothing but her handbag because I did not allow either parent to remove or photograph the originals. David remained long enough to tell Emily she would regret standing against family. She answered that family was not supposed to require two sisters to remain enemies, so their parents could stay comfortable. North Star completed its review near the end of June, almost 6 weeks after its first email. The company did not judge my parents' marriage or decide which childhood memory was morally correct. Its compliance team concluded that the campaign used an identifiable image without my consent, presented disputed personal claims as verified fact, and continued after Emily knew those claims were inaccurate. North Star terminated the current campaign under its consent, accuracy, and reputational risk provisions. Keepsake Journeys had to return roughly $70,000 in unused expansion funds, but North Star had no power to close Emily's company or fire her employees. The posts featuring my parents were removed, and the remaining family-themed content was suspended. Emily kept her 6 employees by canceling the expansion, reducing her own salary, and returning to smaller client trips. To complete the removal of the inaccurate campaign and protect the business she still had, she published a correction in her own words. She stated that I had not voluntarily abandoned our family, that I had not authorized the use of my childhood image, and that she had repeated a story she failed to verify before using it commercially. I did not write the statement for her. North Star checked only the portions connected to its campaign, and Emily left the rest unpolished. The apology was not beautiful, but it was hers. After she posted it, Emily came to my house and asked why I had withheld the recording of her at 6. I told her, "Because you were a child. They used your voice against me once. I won't use it against you now." "Then why did you send the rest?" she asked. "Because you weren't a child when you sold their lie." Emily lowered her eyes, then nodded. She did not call me cruel, and I did not soften the answer. Mercy did not require pretending adulthood had never arrived. That evening, my phone vibrated with a message from Carol. She wrote, "This family is falling apart because of you." I stared at the sentence for a long time, thinking about the empty chairs, the locked chest, and the years I had mistaken disappearance for peace. Then I placed my fingers on the screen and began typing my final answer. I typed, "No, this family was held together by my disappearance, and I stopped disappearing." Before I blocked my mother's number, I sent one final message explaining the only way she could contact me. She could write a letter and take responsibility for her own choices without blaming David, Emily, Margaret, fear, marriage, or circumstances. I would not accept messages delivered through relatives, and I would not attend a meeting designed to repair my parents' marriage. Then I blocked her for 1 year. It was different from the silence I had used in the past. I was not vanishing and forcing her to guess why. I had stated the boundary, the reason, and the condition under which it might change. David remained unblocked by email because I wanted a written record, but the result was predictable. He sent 6 messages during the next 2 months. Each began with an apology and ended with a defense. He was sorry he had failed to protect me, but Carol had controlled the information. He regretted the voicemail, but he had been under enormous pressure. He wished he had made another choice, but I had been difficult and angry at 13. I replied only once, reminding him that I had asked for an apology without my mother's name in it. His next email contained her name in the second paragraph. By July, my parents were living separately. Carol stayed in a furnished apartment outside Raleigh, while David remained in the house and described the separation as temporary. I learned this through relatives who had finally stopped treating my mother as the central office for family information. When Carol announced that Thanksgiving would still be held at her new apartment, my aunt asked everyone directly where they wanted to gather instead of accepting Carol's plan. David invited Emily and me to a private reconciliation session with a counselor he had chosen. I declined. Their marriage had used my absence as structural support for 25 years, but that did not make me responsible for holding it upright after the truth removed me. Emily's consequences were more immediate. Keepsake Journeys returned the unused North Star funds, canceled the expansion, and removed every childhood photograph from its website. She replaced the family-centered slogan with plain information about destinations, prices, and services. The new site was less emotional, and probably less memorable, but it no longer required a false sister to make the owner look loyal. She kept all 6 employees by reducing her own salary, ending a lease on a larger office she had planned to occupy, and returning to smaller client trips. When one longtime customer asked whether the scandal meant Emily could not be trusted, she did not blame North Star, our parents, or me. She said she had repeated a family story she had never properly verified, used it commercially, and accepted the consequences. I heard about that conversation from Emily herself, because she forwarded the customer's email and her complete response under our rule. She never asked me to post a statement defending her. That mattered. An older version of Emily would have treated my silence as another injury. The woman she was trying to become understood that correcting a lie did not entitle her to public praise from the person harmed by it. My relationship with Margaret and Thomas changed too. I continued visiting, but we did not pretend the private contact agreement had been erased by their love for me. Margaret apologized without saying she had only wanted to protect me. She said she had allowed fear to make decisions that belonged to me, and then repeated that mistake after I became an adult by deciding I was better off not knowing. Thomas admitted he had supported her because keeping peace in their home felt easier than reopening a fight with my parents. His honesty disappointed me, but disappointment was healthier than worship. Margaret and Thomas had raised me, shown up for me, and loved me. They had also failed me in ways that mattered. I no longer needed to turn them into perfect replacement parents to prove Carol and David had been wrong. At the end of that conversation, Margaret asked what I wanted them to be called at future family events. I told her the truth. Margaret and Thomas. Her eyes filled, but she smiled. That's enough. It always was. The cedar chest remained in their house, but it was no longer locked. I placed every original letter, cassette, authorization, and receipt in archival folders, added a written index, and stored digital copies separately. The brass key with the 2 birds stayed inside the top drawer. It had done its job. The chest was no longer a container for secrets. It was a record no one person could control again. Emily and I did not become close overnight. Some weeks we exchanged only documents or brief messages. She still became defensive when I questioned her memory, and I still had to resist ending conversations the moment I felt rejected. We followed the rules because neither of us trusted emotion alone. One afternoon in August, Emily forwarded a message from Carol without adding a single word. "Erin has poisoned you against your own family. One day you'll understand what she has taken from us." I read it, waited until my anger passed, and replied to Emily with one word: "Thank you." She did not ask whether I wanted to discuss it. She did not defend our mother, or suggest that Carol was suffering. She sent a thumbs up and left the message where it belonged: visible, unchanged, and unable to divide us. Nearly 4 months after the wedding, Nathan and I invited Margaret and Thomas to a small dinner at our house. It was not an anniversary or a replacement ceremony. It was simply a thank you for the people who had carried flowers, fixed my veil, danced badly, and stayed after the guests left to help pack the car. Before they arrived, Nathan found me standing over 4 place cards at the dining table. Ours already read Erin and Nathan. On the other 2, I had written Margaret and Thomas. No titles. No borrowed roles. No suggestion that one pair of parents had been replaced by another. Nathan looked at the cards and asked, "Are you sure?" "Yes," I said. "The names are enough." During dinner, Thomas told the story of nearly falling during the group dance, even though all of us had watched it happen. Margaret brought the wedding photograph from the terrace in a simple wooden frame. In it, she was wearing the brass key. Thomas was leaning slightly toward her, and Nathan's hand was wrapped around mine. No one looking at the picture would know how much fear the key had caused somewhere in Costa Rica. They would only see 4 people who had been present. After dessert, Nathan brought in the mail. One postcard had no return address, but I recognized Emily's handwriting. The front showed 2 birds drawn in blue ink. The larger bird stood beside the smaller one. There was no fence between them. On the back, Emily had written, "No messenger, no second version. This came directly from me." I did not call her that night. One honest postcard could not repair 14 years of adult choices or 25 years of separation. Forgiveness was not a reward handed out after the first correct action. It was something trust might eventually make possible if the actions continued. But I did not place the postcard inside the cedar chest. I set it beside the wedding photograph. For years, I believed the 2 empty chairs at my wedding proved I had been rejected again. I know better now. They did not show who had refused to come. They showed me who had arrived, who stayed, and who no longer needed a title to belong at my table. My parents thought they could erase me and still use my story. They were wrong. I did not destroy their family, their marriage, or Emily's campaign. I simply stopped lending my silence to all 3. You should never confuse silence with peace, because silence can protect those who caused the harm. When relatives tell different stories, compare facts, save messages, and speak directly to the person involved instead of trusting a messenger, you can forgive someone's fear without excusing the choices they made as an adult. Healthy boundaries are not cruelty. They are clear rules that protect your dignity and prevent manipulation from returning. Most importantly, do not let anyone build success from a false version of your life. If this story helped you, subscribe to the channel for more family dramas and hard-earned lessons.